y'all. We are gonna get this ball rolling. Hi, good evening. Happy Friday Eve or happy Friday Junior, depending on which you celebrate. I am Paula McMillan-Perez. I am a licensed clinical social worker, as you can tell by the first slide, licensed in New York and New Jersey. I am a rather well-seasoned school social worker, and I'm also a psychotherapist who provides specialty services in the realm of ADHD and anxiety, and a podcast host. Today, we are going to be talking a little bit about effective supports for ADHD. This is going to be tailored a little bit because I'm not, though there's probably a bulk of social workers here on this webinar. One of the things that I find is that these are strategies that could be helpful regardless to whether you work in a school setting, work with youth, or work with adults, because ADHD impacts us all. So just write y'all's questions down because I want to make sure that I'm able to answer what comes up for everyone. I may answer as we're going through the presentation, but if you feel like you want a little bit more breadth of knowledge, then we're definitely going to tackle that near the end. Next slide, please. Okay, so our agenda, just so we kind of have a sense of, what to expect in this presentation, just a quick housekeeping. Then we're going to go into talking a little bit about supporting teaching interventions. We're going to talk a little bit about integrating tech into counseling. And this doesn't necessarily have to be strictly counseling. It can be in whatever realms kind of make sense for the work that you're doing or would love to do. Then we're going to talk a little bit about parent and guardian communication, because depending on where you work or how you're working, this can play an essential role in really supporting and cultivating wraparound services for the individuals that you're working with. And then we're going to talk a little bit about resource management, like what are some of the resources that are accessible to you, free and low cost, y'all, because we're not trying to spend an arm, a leg, and a kidney. Plus, many of our organizations, there may be funding difficulties, or maybe they just don't want to slide the funds to you. So what are some cost-effective ways that we can kind of increase and infuse the resources that we have accessibility to that also kind of meet the needs of our clients? And Q&A. I'm down to answer any and all questions that you have. Yeah, so that's pretty much what this evening is going to look like. So housekeeping. So this is a webinar format. So clearly we're going to get a presentation. I talk a lot, but I try to give things that are realistic and could be useful in your work, your day-to-day, options that you may give to friends, family members, because ADHD is a diagnosis that impacts so many of us. I'm one of those people, so that's why I do this work. You got your personal needs. Can't see you on camera, but that's okay. Take care of what you need to take care of. And if you feel like maybe there's a question that wasn't answered in my presentation because you stepped away, please write that down and address it near the end. So I call the question section a parking lot. So when you're writing it down, whether it's a sticky, a note on your phone, that's your parking lot, because we're always going to come back to it the way we might come back to a car or another vehicle. And then your resource page, as you're hearing things that I'm talking about, or maybe you're brainstorming other resources that you either currently use in your work, you heard someone mention, but you're not necessarily sure, and you want to work that into a question, that's going to be the beginning of the resource page that you develop for yourself. Later on in the presentation, I do mention some specific resources that you can add to your list, but I do encourage you, as you're brainstorming and reflecting on what you're hearing, to write things down, because you'd be surprised how many resources you currently have access to, but don't necessarily think that it may work within this realm. So just a little food for thought. Next slide, please. Okay, so most of us have a general working knowledge of what ADHD is and or how it may present, though it looks pretty different depending on who you're looking at, or maybe what your experience is with regard to the population that you're working with. There's cultural implications that impact how it manifests visually. And then we have, how it manifests academically, behaviorally. There are a couple of different things. But the baseline definition that we work with, it refers to individuals who display patterns of inattention, impulsivity, and overactive behavior that tend to interfere with some of the daily functioning. And that is usually executive functioning. We can go into so many different ways that could look, whether it's individuals who identify as girls or boys, individuals who identify as non-binary, those individuals who come from different cultures, who have migrated to this current society that we're living in, things present differently based on a variety of different factors. But if we're looking at it from the DSM perspective, we have 3 types that are pretty prevalent in how we break down ADHD. So predominantly inattentive, I call that type 1. So it's just like when it comes to like the academic setting, which we're gonna primarily focus on, but those things spill up over into other areas, as we know. Submitting work with inaccuracies or is incomplete is one of the top things that kind of presents itself. But if you think about it, like when you're at home, you ask maybe your child to do the dishes or take out the trash. Okay, so you took out the trash, but you left the garbage can open and you ain't put a bag back. Not complete. Or the sponge was sitting there after the dishes were done. Maybe the water was still running, which I have heard from clients. So that's something that comes from there's that lack of attention because we're not as attentive to certain tasks. So difficulty attending to conversations. That's something, surprise, surprise, I also struggle with because there could be a stream of consciousness, a dialogue that is happening, but it can be really challenging depending on a few different factors. And usually what happens here is that it's not that you don't have the desire to pay attention or you're bored, but it's just that the inattentiveness makes it very challenging to be as present as we would like to be, especially if it is not something, and when I say we, I mean for us neurodivergent folks with ADHD, but it's something that we tend to struggle with because we don't have the same mental investment as the other person. But that is not to negate the value in the conversation. That just speaks to where our neurodivergence is. And it's not just conversations. It could be engaging in activities. Some parents are very surprised to find out, even if a student or their youth is playing a video game, that they could be inattentive to that because that's something that they love. But if it's not capturing their attention in a way that really speaks to their neurodivergence, their ability to be as attentive or as present is very challenging. Same with daily tasks, whether it's academic, whether it's personal. Again, we have mentioned that executive functioning piece, or even thinking about proprioception, which is our body's kind of like ability to be spatially aware. Many folks with ADHD, they bump into stuff. We think things are closer than they appear, similar to like our car mirrors. So we feel clumsy. We are clumsy, and that's a piece of it. That's it's inattentiveness that is coming up again because that spatial awareness, that system is a little bit disrupted. Difficulty following directions. Those of you who have worked in or do work in professions where you are in a teaching capacity, there's a lot of directions. At home, basic learning, parents, we're our child's first teachers. You are giving step-by-step directions. Teachers will say what to do directions. It can be challenging. Yes, they could be numbered and they could be linear, but it isn't as seamless as we would think that it is. We love to think that it's easy when we give things out in directions, but it can be really challenging. It can also be challenging to get started, or when we start, what does that even look like? Oh, but I don't need this step. I can skip over number 3 and get to number 6 because I know how to do the other ones. So there are a variety of different reasons how this manifests and how it can look. So it could be something to take into consideration if even you as an adult are in a space where you're like, this is harder than I feel like it should be. And then losing materials or difficulty organizing tasks and materials. That is one of the biggest things that come up, especially with, and I'm going to say middle school because that was my sweet spot for some time, because it doesn't make sense. It's just like, we have the stuff, it's in our bag, or it's in the house, like we know where it is, but it may not necessarily be serving its purpose in that time, especially if there's a lack of disorganization. Things like when students get homework or other assignments, they need a permission slip signed. Or let's say there was a doctor's appointment, we got to school late or we were absent and we had to bring the doctor's note in to get excused. Most of the time, that is not something that will get slid into a folder or a notebook, prioritized and remembered for the first time that we are able to go in the morning. It's a regular occurrence. And there has to be systems and things set up so that it kind of reduces some of the occurrences of these things, and also strategies put in place in the classroom or in other community-based places and spaces, other homes, if there are children who may go from one parent to the other, grandparent, things of that nature. Having a consistent system in each place that can mirror the original system or be the same system is another strategy that can be helpful with predominantly inattentive type. Then we have predominantly hyperactive and impulsive. So type 2, oh, that was 4. So type 2. So appear to be in constant motion, like that person, child, adolescent that never seems to sit down. And if they do sit down, they pop right back up. So one of the ways that I have described this, especially to youth, is thinking about Tigger from Winnie the Pooh. Tigger has the ability to sit. He has the ability to engage in conversation, always high energy, ready to go, want to be helpful, always consistently moving, whether it's his body or his mouth. So it seems like, damn, they don't ever run out of energy because they don't sit down. And then with that is the regular fidgeting and moving. I, as you can see, gesticulate. Like I'm always talking with my hands. That is a pretty traditional thing for folks of color, but individuals who have ADHD, they are frequently moving. And as we have seen in the past several years, fidget toys have gained in popularity. They've dipped a little bit, but that has been an extremely helpful strategy for individuals to like have something to do with their hands. If you think back to times when people were clicking their pens all the time and it just sounded like an annoying thing, or some of the traditional signs and symbols of like anxiety, like knee tapping, or just bouncing their leg up and down, tapping their finger on a desk. Sometimes it's, for some folks, it's stroking the end or the edge of their cell phone. Like myself, I wear a ring where you can spin it. That is one of the fidgets that I utilize because it's accessible to me. And then moving in the seat. There are a lot of wiggle seats that you'll see in classrooms, a variety of ages going from kindergarten all the way up until high school, because it has that tactile stimulation that allows the support for the person that is moving in their seat to gain something, because they are frequently moving. So we want to make sure that they're in places and spaces where they can do this safely and hopefully isn't disruptive to the other members of either the classroom or the space that they're in. But this is not an uncommon thing, and it may look different. So for other individuals who may have ADHD and that may be coupled with, let's say for the sake of argument, some additional sensory needs, or if there is a dual diagnosis of ADHD and autism, these are things that may present differently, even though they're still happening. So it can be something that is helpful to kind of look out for. If it's a situation where, let's say you are working with maybe a older adolescent or an adult, you can also ask about some experiences that they have had when they were in school or in places where they were expected to sit still and be quiet. And then you can gain a lot of information about what that looks like, as well as, depending on the current capacity in which you're working with folks, just the general nonverbals, because it's to be able to just sit is very challenging for a variety of different reasons. So your general observations as professionals can be really helpful to allow you to poke holes as in identifying what type, especially if you know that there's a clear ADHD diagnosis that you're seeing, because many times, depending on who you were diagnosed by, when, and things of that nature, there isn't much specificity into which type you are presenting with. Become restless and become restless during quiet activity. It's just hard. It's not a thing that we're able to do very easily. We want to move on to the next thing because there isn't that regular stimulation, because we are just so impulsive. It's a thing that has strategies that we can work on to reduce it, but it is actively something that people are going to work on because it's hard. Everybody's being quiet. You want to be loud. You want to say something. You want to move. You just have the desire, and it's taking any and everything that you have in your body to follow the norm, the status quo, the expectation. So that may look like some of those other behaviors that I mentioned before: clicking, tapping, making noises with the mouth. While I still can't whistle, I used to, which I know is an annoying sound, but I wanted to give you an example. Or that water drop noise that still in all my years of age, I can't figure out how to do, just to have that level of stimulation to speak to that impulsivity. Leaving the seat regardless of expectation. It's like you can't put Velcro on the seat. This is something that I've even seen happen in college classrooms. I've seen happen with staff that have worked in schools and community organizations, individuals that may feel like they need to stand in the back of the room or walk to one corner because that's a way that they're able to at least manage their impulsivity, because it's really hard to just sit down for an indeterminate amount of time. It could be that that's the only way that they possibly have learned to regulate. But if they are leaving their seat, it could just be for the simplest things. I forgot a pencil. I have to use the bathroom. I have to go get water. I forgot this. I didn't eat. And usually one of the things that come up for folks with this, not that folks are just trying to be annoying, but it's really hard to be able to verbally articulate. It is challenging. It is hard. I can't sit in this seat. And even for those of us that may hear it who identify as neurotypical, it's like, but why? Because it doesn't connect in the same way, because like that's a level of your neurodivergence that isn't necessarily traditionally understood and respected. But there are scaffolds that can be put in place if this is something that either has become problematic or disruptive, because these are skills that we're going to have to learn. So it moves into the behavioral techniques of the intervention. Interrupting others and classroom activities. This is probably one of the biggest ones that people struggle with. I do as well, because it's just, you're almost bursting at the seams and can't imagine what it's like to hold on to the thought or the idea. Or for most of us, it's because we're just so terrified that we're going to forget, and it was something so valuable and so worthwhile that we just kind of wanted to get it out. Meaning no rudeness and no disrespect, but that again speaks to that impulsivity, speaks to that hyperactive brain, those pieces that we just want to get out and share to the best of our ability. And it can be really challenging too, not just in small group work, but in large classroom activities, or it can be challenging in organized sports or another organized activity. This has come up a lot for clients that I've worked with in church activities, family reunions, even places that have a more social feel, because the expectation, and then if we think about the cultural piece, how many of us was able to interrupt our parents when they was talking? How many of us was even able to talk when adults were talking? So these are things and themes that will come up in different places and spaces. And it's just like, oh, you know what you're supposed to do. You need to sit down and be quiet. Children are seen and not heard. Things of that nature doesn't really align with the developmental needs of somebody with ADHD, because a lot of those are cultural practices that have been brought down for a variety of different reasons. But we're in a learning space. We are in a generational trauma breaking cycle. So these are things that we teach into now. And then, as I'm doing right now, talking excessively, because I like to talk. I like to provide information, but a lot of it is because it is a consistent flowing stream of consciousness that happens. And I want to make sure that I get things out, especially in a format like this, because we have limited time. And I want to be able to give and share and offer as much of my expertise as I think could be helpful. And even if it's not helpful, that's for you to glean what makes sense and what doesn't. But it can be a really challenging thing if we don't have an awareness. So part of the struggle sometimes with the impulsivity and with the hyperactivity is lack of awareness. Again, a skill that can be taught. And also, depending on the way our support systems look and the individuals that we work with, one of the other things is that we can also develop signals where folks let us know, all right, like, calm it down a little bit, or just a little, or some other type of signal that has been helpful or identified with both parties, because it's also something that has been identified to cause a lot of shame with individuals, and it can be turned inward, especially if they don't have a support system where they could communicate with, and then that can lead to other behaviors. Struggles with following classroom procedures. So those rules and norms that come up in every classroom from 3K all the way up to college can feel really challenging. One, because not all grades and places are the norms or rules posted. That is a strategy that can be extremely helpful because memory is not always our strong suit. We need something to anchor. Not to say that if those anchors are there, that they're 100% going to eradicate the issue, but it is a struggle to kind of like follow the regular expectations and decorum, and not to say that things are completely out of pocket, but it can be a real challenge and something that needs to be strategized and worked through. And then type 3, combined type. We have symptoms exhibited from both categories. Now, in this situation, it may not necessarily be all of the things that I just reviewed, but it could be some bits and pieces. So surprise, surprise, I have combined type. So I identified some of which come up for me, but there are some that do not. And then there are some that may manifest in individuals who identify as male. Some may manifest and identify with those of us who identify as female. There has been a real negative connotation that boys will primarily fall into type 2, hyperactive and impulsive, and girls will primarily fall into type 1, inattentive type. That is not necessarily accurate. Granted, the data has showed, but we have to also think about who is being polled in the data and the research. If I think about some of the longitudinal studies that I have read, there have not been as many looking at children of color in urban areas, densely populated areas. So I don't necessarily feel like, and I could be wrong here because, you know, it's been a while since I got my hands on a recently researched journal article, but the data that I had utilized when putting together this presentation and some of my recent work did identify these themes. And there wasn't as much research with combined type, though it has increased over, I'd say, the last 8 or so years, especially with the data that we've been able to receive from the earlier days of the pandemic. But I would be really interested in those longitudinal studies in a decade. But that's me. Next slide, please. So, academic interventions. So one of the things that I just want to note before I go down this road is that, yes, these interventions are primarily and specifically designed for academic settings. But there are those of you or individuals that you work with that may have mock academic settings. So it could be something like a small group tutoring. It could be tutoring at the kitchen table with you and your child, or you might be you know, working with your niece, nephew, things of that nature. So these could also be things that, depending on the access that you have to the child's educator, or if you are, let's say, a college professor or a college advisor, you may have had a student or your advisee let you know that they have ADHD, and you can perhaps talk about what were, if they knew, because this is another struggle. Sometimes their ability to participate in some of these conversations wasn't necessarily prevalent at the time. So these could also be new conversations. So these are things that also come up and can be turnkeyed into outside of academic settings. Esther, yes, some kids have a 504 and not an IEP. So there is some overlap because there are some things that can be similar with both, but we don't necessarily always have students who have ADHD that have either, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be supports put in place. So, for the most part, and this is not every situation, but this is also something that I advocate for when I'm speaking with parents, whether they are in the evaluation process, they just got it and they're not sure what it looks like in schools, is that a lot of the interventions that are put in place in the academic setting are initiated by formal or informal assessments. But the biggest piece that makes it the most successful is the collaboration with school staff and students. I'll say it again, and students. And it may feel like, okay, well, they're maybe too young to play a role to have a conversation. It's the best time to start because we can build on it, especially if they're not in what we identify as a developmental place and space for them to kind of access everything. But the immersion and the modeling is really important. We'll get into that a little bit later. And family members. one of the chief complaints that I've heard from folks is that as students begin to age, the parents kind of like dial it back. So if you have a high school student, they're, oh, like they're not messing with them because they're already grown. Now, that may or may not be true, but we can also kind of do a little digging to identify why. For those of us who might be working in community-based settings and we're not even in an academic setting, once we get that HIPAA release to speak to the school, then it would be helpful to understand some of the information it is that they're seeing. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the school counselor or the school social worker. You'd be surprised the amount of information you can get from the classroom teacher. If it is a student that does have an IEP and are in special education, if they have a 504, if they are receiving ABA in school, because sometimes that does happen for students who have an autism classification. There are even some students who have a OHI, other health impairment classification, that have just specific things that are tailored as well. So it can be really helpful to get a sense of who's seeing what, because for those of you who may not have kids or don't work with kids in school, these kids be different in school than they are at home. If I had a nickel for every time a parent was like, oh, my child don't do that at home, and the parent really believes it, because it's a different presentation and a different manifestation in school for a lot of different reasons. There are kids that feel so safe in school, more so than they do at home, and vice versa. Plus a whole host of other environmental, social, emotional factors, social determinants of health that come up and they play a role as well. But at the root of all of that, all those different situations, the collaboration piece is what makes us successful. Because, and I always say this, persistence over consistence. Because with ADHD and a lot of other neurodivergence that happen, it is extremely difficult for us to be consistent. And we feel a lot of guilt and shame. And much of that starts during youth. And it's something we carry with us and need to unlearn, or hopefully want to unlearn, as we realize that we don't have to keep doing this. So the goal is to work towards persevering and persisting with increasing some skills and abilities to reduce that shame and increase improvement, whether it's academic, social, emotional, or otherwise. So one of the ways that we do that is through tiers. Everything's a tiered system. So we want to do step by step, because we can't get to the top of the mountain unless we climb. Granted, you know, some of us ain't really trying to mess with a mountain, but do with that analogy as you will. So the first thing that we're going to do, and this is something that we can do for any and everybody, even if they don't have ADHD, if there may be a thought that possibly that's a thing that's happening, we're going to want to do some behavioral strategies and interventions. So one of the things that I suggest to folks is some of the behaviors or the manifestations that you're seeing, which, you know, we covered a little bit on the initial slide, is picking one. I have a big thing about the one thing method. We don't want to get overwhelmed, and we don't want to overwhelm the people that we're working with, especially if they're youth. So we want to try one thing and do that one thing with fidelity, one strategy, one intervention. Now, the benefit of doing one thing is because you can spend time focusing on that. And if you need to take a break because it's too challenging, you can do so, but you don't have to pick up and figure out where you were, because you just have to go back to one thing. On top of the fact, thinking about that collaboration piece, you can work with or collaborate with the parent, teacher, or maybe this is something that was initiated in one place, like school, and then it transitions to the home, or vice versa. And it's really important for the youth or client, or whatever you refer to the person you're working with, to be a part of the process. And if they're not in a developmental place or space where they're able to do that just yet, then we're going to start using language and modeling, so they're hearing the same thing at home that they're hearing in school, because it will resonate. We planting seeds, y'all. A lot of this is planting seeds. So there are a bunch of different interventions that we can utilize, and then we can kind of do a little tracking. Now, this is not me telling you to get out more documentation, but sometimes it can kind of be helpful. But you know the person that you're working with best. Do you want to monitor that monthly? Do you want to say, you know what, let's try this out for 2 weeks and maybe track the inconsistencies? Because it does take a while again, because again, there goes that consistency thing. We want to persist. We want to persevere. So what does that look like within a realistic time frame based on your professional expertise? Then tier 2 is more tailored to the ADHD diagnoses. So in this situation, if we're thinking about students who already have an existing IEP, this can be a manifestation FBA. Let me say what it is, because not everybody works in school. I apologize. An FBA is a functional behavioral assessment. So it's basically, we talked a little bit about the formal and informal assessment. So teachers, for the most part, could be special educators, counselors and social workers, people like myself and other individuals in the building will basically assess students' behavior in the classroom setting, and probably in different classroom settings. So if it were me, I would want to go into the class that maybe they're struggling in academically, or maybe it's just something they don't like, but they haven't articulated why. And then I'd go into a class where, they're enjoying. So maybe like a art, a music, or maybe something where they're just generally engaged in the material. And I also like to do some observances, brief interactions during lunch, recess, or other times when they're social with their friends, so I can get a better sense of what the contrast looks like between a more relaxed social emotional setting and also a more structured academic setting, because the structure piece also makes a lot of sense for folks with ADHD as well. So that's something to think about. And then a BIP, you're going to take all the data that you received and that you were able to document and synthesize from your own assessment, the FBA, and maybe from others. We can come together as a team. Hopefully your school has an interdisciplinary, yes, an interdisciplinary team. In some places it's called a child study team. In some places it's called case conference. So whatever team that pretty much is made up of a stakeholder from each of the departments that works holistically with the child, and they'll put that data together, and then that data will be synthesized to generate the BIP, also known as Behavioral Intervention Plan. So it's where we decide what are the most realistic interventions to put in place to address some of the behaviors. So that's not to say that we aren't working on some of the strategies from tier 1, but it could be that because we are in tier 2, and these are students that have been diagnosed or they're working through themes, that we're just, trying to level up on it. And it could be that that same strategy from tier 1 we're working on, but we have a little more caveat and a little bit more scaffold for support. And then we have tier 3. So more personalized integrative practices. So the way I like to break this down is just like, if you have 2 students who may be manifesting the same type of behaviors in the class, one of the things that you may notice is that one of the students at a certain point in the day, or maybe if it's like a certain day, like if they have 2 parents who are separated, and that student spends time with one parent over the weekend, and they come back and they're a different kid than how they are when they're with the primary parent. This could be a time that we want to tailor a practice. So utilizing that same example, I had a student who would come back completely dysregulated on Monday. The situation with those parents were that dad kept the kid every weekend. Like that was just his plan because of his work schedule, and the mother was fine with it, but the kid was with the mother during the week. So he would come back dysregulated for a variety of different reasons, spatially and otherwise. So we had a structured check-in every Monday. And if it was a time where there was a 3-day weekend, usually didn't go back to mom's house, so we'd have that structured check-in on a Tuesday. And it took a while to identify what steps needed to be taken in that check-in to best set him up to be able to go through a whole school day. And that started from a morning check-in, to getting him into the classroom, to going through all of the steps of what needed to do to wind down to be best prepared to receive information to learn. That was a process, y'all. But what ended up happening was that was a system that he was able to take with him anytime anything changed, even down to when the school had a half a day, because it would change the regulation of his cycle, what he was to expect during the day. And that was very challenging for him, and it would leave him very activated. So identifying a personalized integrative practice can be really helpful when there are layers, kind of like what is being seen, but you're just like, I could do the same thing for two kids or this group of kids, but I'm seeing some things that kind of don't necessarily match. So you can take your stock plan, whatever that does look like, and then identify where is something that you want to interweave. Because the goal here is not to reinvent the wheel. Y'all are already doing a lot, and we are grateful. I am grateful for you all. But we want to kind of take what are some things that we're doing in our regular day-to-day that we can kind of integrate that kind of speak to where people are and meeting them with a more tailored approach. So giving directions, it's another one. So we talked about how like the direction pieces are hard. Like it's hard to follow. So what about the number? If you think about, and you may think back to your own experiences in school, you might have had a list of directions that was like this, and it was just overwhelming when you saw it. So you were just like, oh. Or that if your brain was anything like mine, it would skip to the ones like, that's stupid. I don't need that. Okay, this is I do this one. I could come back to that later. Because then you start bargaining. What do I need to do right now? Oh, I don't need to, I know how to do that. And then that part becomes challenging because then you may be missing steps because you think the fluidity doesn't apply to you because you're just that good. So one of the strategies that can be helpful here in determining an appropriate intervention is limiting the number of directions, because the goal is not to start out the step of the new task or what is being asked to be done or produced with overwhelm. So if you want to do two, well, you already know I'm going to say the one thing, but depending on if you are in a classroom with other students, it may not be realistic to give one direction at a time. But it could also be something that you can explore if you want to give one direction at a time. Is it someone's job at the table to make sure everyone is good before we could move on to the next step? That was something that I used to do in my groups. And then that the table captain or the whatever term that was utilized would rotate so everyone would have a turn, because y'all know with the little kids that was going to start beef. So it gave the opportunity to kind of everyone goes at a slower pace. And it's not one of those things where it's like, oh, it's just isolated because this person has ADHD or they can't do it. But it could also be something that gets scaffolded. But for the most part, depending on where they are developmentally, I would suggest no more than 3 if it's feasible. And then if it's a stock template or plan, we can kind of break it down. But realistically, one of the best things that we can do is change the format. So what does the form look like? So a giant help is a checklist because you physically have to check it off. So some of us are in a place, in a space where that's not necessarily needed, but it can be really helpful. And for individuals who, like us, who do tend to have struggles with executive functioning, starting a bunch of tasks, not finishing them, or starting something thinking that you're done and you have to go back and do a revision, a check mark can really feel like a badge of honor. And it can feel like a way that we can complete. So that's definitely something to consider in terms of interventions. And this is also something that can be done at home. Big proponent of a dry erase board. Like the amount of dry erase boards I have in my house, oh my God. But it's helpful because I can see it. I even keep a dry erase board on the back of my front door. Do we have our keys? Do we have our lunch? What are the things we need? And I have to check it off because I can see it and think I have it. But if it's not checked off, I know it's not done. So that is something that you can start from like a younger age, and it's a good strategy regardless of whether you're neurodivergent or not. Then we have written assignments. So there are ways that you can go about deconstructing what are the pieces of a written assignment. Thinking about an essay, like we need to have like our introduction, or we need to have like our body, our evidence. So instead of just maybe doing a whole sheet with all of the steps, it's like, okay, part 1 is the introduction. We're only going to focus on that. So we're going to build our essay in pieces. Some of y'all, most of y'all probably went to social work school. I threw a capstone. It was broken out into 4 papers. Saved my life because it was completely overwhelming to think about how I was going to have to put together 30 some odd pages. So we need to deconstruct things in ways that make sense. Or for written assignments, we can also begin to identify, are we even able to go in that order? Like, how does it feel for us? Hopefully we have educators and parents and other community stakeholders that help us. Like for context, even doing this presentation, I do my last slides first because those are the things that I'm most excited about. Not that I'm not excited about interventions, but those are the things that I use most in the practice. They're fresh in my mind, and I want to kind of think about what that looks like. So for some of us, starting at the end is starting at the beginning, but that is not a traditional way that we are trained or spoken to in school. But again, with the neurodivergence, the way our brains work and function look differently. So sometimes we have to deconstruct and build back up better in a way that speaks to us, but we also have to learn what that looks like based on the construct of what is being asked. And then organization. Lord, I don't fully have it down, and I'm not going to act like I do, but I have improved because we do trial and error. So a few strategies that can be really helpful in terms of developing interventions. Assignment notebook. Okay, is this homework? Just homework goes in one notebook. Or is this classwork? That goes in one notebook. In a lot of schools now, they're doing things where kids can't take stuff home because if they take it home, they lose it. So that's actually less on them because they're clear on, oh, if I did it in school, it's in school. It lives in that place. So what am I responsible for? But having that clear delineation. I mean, you know, I'm old school. I was in the Trapper Keeper days and, you know, Lisa Frank and all that. So having that binder with, you know, the tabs, I thought that was great, but I was still losing things because I needed to see it. I needed to have the differentiation. Color coding can really be helpful as well because it draws your eye to it. It may be something where you have a specific color that reminds you of something. Like for me, red was always math. I was a struggling math student. So I already knew if something was red in my book bag, it was related to math, whether it was the folder or the notebook. And it was something that allowed my memory also to work. Accountability partners. I'm doing body dumpling, not today, but like to get work done. Sometimes we just need someone to help us bounce ideas off of, to just sit in silence and work next to each other. What are you working on? Oh, did you do that thing that you said? You said you was going to make that doctor's appointment for a physical. Is that something you think you could get done by like next week, like when we check in? Or I'll text you and remind you that we're supposed to have brunch because I know sometimes like things get funky with the calendar. That does help because it's not coming from a place of you didn't do this. It's just like, oh, just checking in to make sure you have what you need. And that can look different in the academic setting, but it's also something that translates well into the personal. And then clean out dates. Lord, this was my favorite time in school because they would just be throwing stuff out their locker, turning over their book bag and just dumping it, and have it be something that everyone can do. Similar to the way we talked about minimizing the directions. Everybody's cleaning out. It's the end of the marking period. It's the end of the semester. Like I noticed that people's book bags, I'm hearing crunches because we don't know what's in there. Let's clean it out. And hopefully nothing crawls out of there. I don't know. But we can kind of get a sense of what's in there because sometimes it's trash. Sometimes it's papers that have been crumpled. Sometimes it's just like, oh, I haven't seen this in so long. And it can help lighten the mental and physical load because now we have a sense of where things are and hopefully it can allow us to be present in the reset. And then just having extras of things, extra paper, extra pencils. Sometimes people want to borrow stuff, yes, but on average, we will leave things in places. So that may be a financial burden to some of our parents, but it's also something that can tend to reduce anxiety because there is a lot of anxiety associated with not being prepared when we have ADHD or something being left out of the corner. Calendars. I live by the Google Calendar. This is a strategy, especially for older students, adolescents, high school, moving into college, learning how to use a calendar, the task function to check things off, because that goes with the checklist. That can be really helpful. Also, remembering responsibilities. When we were young, we could remember everything. As we aged and we had more things on our plate, it was challenging. And the benefit, too, of a calendar is visual. Yes, it could be on your phone, but similar to how I mentioned the dry erase board, we can put it up in places so we can see what's upcoming. We can possibly physically cross things off or check them off as they pass. And that is also an accurate representation of what we were able to complete, because we are not strong at completing things all the time, and that can help boost our confidence in that lens. Next slide, please. Classroom scaffolds and counseling scaffolds. So these are things that kind of like roll into some of the interventions that I mentioned before. So peer tutoring. So some students really struggle with tutoring. So, and I know I have an immigrant parent, so the way they learn math It's not the way they teach in math here. So it can be really challenging when we're trying to support our kiddos, or even if you're a community-based counselor and you're asking about how school is going, and then they show you something and you're like, peer tutoring can be helpful. Now, it could be a tutoring program that was within the school, or it could even be something outside of school that's community-based, but they have that SEL vibe. They can feel more comfortable learning from someone that they know, and they're able to capture their attention in a way that isn't typically traditionally happening in school with a teacher-student rather than peer-to-peer. And sometimes peers, especially if they know who they're dealing with, what they're going to do is pretty much kind of vibe with the same person because they know who's good at what subject. And then cooperative learning, we're learning like all together. So even if it's maybe a reinforcement, so it's like we kind of learned it, we kind of grasped it. We're all kind of learning from each other. Like, I know this piece, you know this piece. Or like, is there another way to explain it? So sometimes the language piece can be really helpful too. And folks with ADHD, because we have that excessive talking, we also try to find ways to reach people in more than just one way. Sharing strategies, like thinking about what works. All right, this doesn't work. I can't do this. Like actually utilizing that in the classroom can be helpful. And then in counseling, especially with group counseling, okay, let's go around, or, round robin, or however we utilize it. What's one way that we can keep our book bags organized? And then everyone can offer something. Even they can offer something that they don't use, but they know that they should. And then it continues to plant the seed. So then there's self-assessment. I meant internal self-assessment, so that's a typo on my end. So self-assessment, kind of getting a sense of like where we are. Those were sheets that I had out. Now, they didn't necessarily need to give them in, but that could be helpful. And then once we commit some of those things to memory, then it's the internal self-assessment, like that check-in with ourselves. So it doesn't have to be external on a Google form or on a sheet of paper or maybe an activity, but it's something that we can do mentally and internally. And there's task supervision. So it's just like, okay, like, Ma, could you like check in on me in like 15 minutes, like if you don't hear any movement? Now, I don't know if these youth today gonna do that, but there are some who have, and it can be helpful because it's like, damn, I know she's coming. I don't want to be out here like not doing anything. Or if like they have a task in school, thinking about like, I'll say like session captain. Like I used to call them Cappy. They hated it, but like I like that. If it was a situation where there were materials that had to be given out to each person, or it was a week where we were doing games, that person was responsible for cleanup and setup, and they can ask for other help. So it really helped for them to kind of like delegate and feel like a sense of autonomy and organization because they had a task. And then self-correction, giving them the opportunity to catch what is happening or what they can fix. And that can be whether it is using a signal or a prompt that is just general, but maybe there had been some prior conversation because we were building interventions, or something that's used at home that triggers that ability to kind of like correct the behavior, correct the task or theme. And then using yourself as a guide. Like, one of the things we want to infuse a lot in, especially our younger youth as they come up, and especially if they're an older sibling, is using themselves as a guide. We are our best learner, but we also have to tap into that level of awareness. So teaching into that in the classroom and in counseling sessions can be really helpful, because it's just like, okay, tell me about yourself. Such a vague question. Absolutely hate it. Not anything that I really tapped into. But what is one thing that you take pride in about your appearance, how you're presenting in school, yourself as a big brother? How we frame the prompts can really be helpful. And then one of my favorites, student-created or student-led reviews. So giving youth the opportunity to take ownership and lead in their own learning, to lead in their own practice, to kind of be like, yeah, I did it right with that, but like, no, I could do better next time. Like, I'm really not with that. Like, that's, we're gonna have to put that on the back burner, or like, that's a no-go, that's a dub. So it can really give them the opportunity to kind of like do their own review, whether it's of a task, of a situation that happened with a peer group, an interaction that happened at home. And then it gives them the ability to allow time for reflection. And then there's the transition friend, like the person that helps them get situated. Like, I'm a hot mess. My book bag is crazy. I'm still eating my lunch. Oh, let me get your book bag for you. Oh, let me grab the do now or the entrance ticket. That friend, that person that can kind of help move things along. So these are just a couple of things that can be utilized, and they can be mixed and matched depending on what the assessment shows they need to work on and how you tailor your interventions. Next slide, please. So then we have our behavior management. So nonverbal supports. We know we ain't trying to be yelling at nobody kid, but what are some other ways we do it? Like some of y'all be doing the eye, some may circle the space. It may be, a posture, a movement that we do. And then check-ins with sounds is one of my favorite. I'm not gonna move it now because there's things in front of it, but I have a singing bowl. It's something that can really anchor. Some folks play music. It can be something that is transitional, that is really helpful because it's like, okay, well, if I hear that sound, that means we're moving in a different direction. We're going to the next thing. We may be cleaning up. So there's usually some type of prompt or direction that comes with it, but it's usually one, and that goes back to the one thing. Visual and environmental prompts, like I had mentioned before, like with the rules and the norms. So if at all possible, if you can have things posted, especially that you know that your youth or your adults, whomever is struggling with, just in places like as gentle reminders. I also did an activity where we also kind of like utilized it, like how do we turn this into an affirmation, something that speaks to us? So we want things to in the space that can be a reminder. Some of us have it on our phones. Some of us have it on our computer. Like, what is the environmental place and space that we take up and how that could be utilized? Resource pages. What are the things they use the most? Because you may have so many things going on that you don't know, okay, I need a tool for this. Like, okay, I'm doing this. I can use bam, bam, bam. And it's accessible. It's available. That could be one of the things that's a visual prompt. Maybe that's on the wall. Maybe it's I have 8 million browser tabs, y'all. Maybe it's a browser tab that you just kind of keep open in your phone or on your computer. Maybe it's a sticky. Maybe it's laminated. Something that is a go-to until it's something you can commit to memory. And if it's not, it's more complex. It has multiple steps. You know that that's a resource that there's for you. Proximity control. All right. Sometimes we can't work near people. We need to sit elsewhere. Sometimes we need to sit at the window. Sometimes we need our back to the window. Even proximity to tactile stimulation. Sometimes it's a distractor. Sometimes it's not. So we need to kind of take into consideration those things. Are people on top of us? Do we have enough room? Can we stretch our legs? Perfect example. I still till this day take tests without shoes on. I need to feel my toes do this. And because it's in proximity to my freedom. Because test taking gives me anxiety. So identifying with your person, your youth, what proximity looks like and what is within their realm of control. A lot of times, especially younger folks, we don't feel like we have a lot of control. So this can be helpful. Timers. I got one right here. Amazon. It's just, like ranges from 5 minutes all the way, 3 minutes all the way up to 60 minutes. Sometimes we get distracted, but either looking at the timer can be anxiety provoking or it could also be anchoring. So it can be really helpful. Music and playlists is a big one because we want to hype up that dopamine before we do things. We always want to hype up that dopamine. Like if those of y'all have never heard of a dopa menu, Google that and you can assist, and I think you should do it for yourselves too, but you can assist in identifying what are some things that do that. For me, it's music. Music is something that most people, they have something that they can anchor to. So you can even develop in your sessions, you can develop a playlist. Like I do anxiety playlists, test taking playlists, cleanup playlists, and that's something that is theirs, that they created, that is of their own volition, and it brings more buy-in because it wasn't just something you said, oh, like, music could be great for you, you should try that. No, let's actively work on it together, and maybe we can add and take away based on what it is. But I love different playlists for different things. And then reinforcement strategies, because unfortunately, consistence don't happen like this. So what we gonna do? We go persist. So reinforcement is just basically a synonym for persisting. So we're gonna offer praise, and we want to do it at a minimum of 3 times. So we gonna, I really like the way that you tried that. It's not always easy to try something new. What is a third one we could put in there? So we're just gonna keep pushing it. And 3 is just enough that it's not overkill. They're gonna be like, nah, but you're doing the most. But just enough to kind of like infuse that positivity. So we're going to acknowledge it as immediately based on when we see it. It may not be instant, but we want to use a shorter time frame so that we're able to kind of also capture it in the memory, because our memories, it be going. So we want to capture it almost immediately as within reason so that we can do that. And then we want to do it with enthusiasm. We want our nonverbals and our verbals to match up. Sometimes we're not as cognizant that it doesn't, depending on what's going on with us as adults. But I guarantee you, kids are feeling it. They're seeing it. They're like, yeah, I don't know about that one. So we want to make sure that it's congruent and with all of our messaging. And we want to say what was deserved. So like that wasn't a good example. Like I really like that you, I'm trying to think of something that has come up. Oh, I really like that you decided to take the initiative and clean out your locker. You didn't wait for nobody else to do it. You did your own thing. And it looked like you were overwhelmed, but you got through it. It's looking great. And you did your book back too. Man, listen. Granted, that was a little bit overkill, but just using an example. Homeschool wraparound, we talked about that consistent support. It is something that is helpful. So if we're doing these reinforcement strategies at school, we want to communicate that to the parent and even say, hey, like, I don't know if this is something that you're doing, but I've really seen what can happen when I do it here, and provide those specific examples, and maybe even support the parent in brainstorming what is one thing that they're going to keep an eye out for to provide reinforcement with. It doesn't have to be everything, but at least if they're hearing similar language at home that they're hearing in school, they're going to feel more investment, feel more confident in their skills and ability. And then verbal and or video feedback. Video is fancy now because like we do FaceTime and all these things, but like as we're doing things like redirection, which isn't always negative, as we are modeling an appropriate behavior or appropriate response, we are going to want to link it to something. If we see it on video, we should say it. But if we're seeing it in real time or using our language, we want to do that as well. And then corrective. If something, we make mistakes here and there, like, I really appreciate that you did that. Something else that we can think about for next time. Not saying, oh, you did that wrong, fix it, but something that we can think about for next time, or something you may want to implement, or have you considered, might you want to try thinking of language like that? And always providing options. These are little individuals, and even the little individuals that turn into medium size and big, I'll say grown, not big, individuals, we like options. A lot of times kids feel like they're always told what to do, when to do it. They don't have any choice. So even if they don't have choice, we want to give them the illusion of options. What could that look like? And it also helps to foster and increase their critical thinking skills when they have options also, especially when it comes to decision making, because this is something that many of our students are lagging in, not just because of the pandemic, but because of a variety of different reasons. So we want to present them with options for them to choose from and think through what makes the most sense. Next slide, please. Parent and guardian communication, y'all. This one is a big one. Now, some parents might be like, y'all bothering me, y'all call me too much, you always sending me something, this, that, and the other. But if you don't get it, and there's still issues, but you didn't reach out to me, you didn't give me anything to work on. So one of the things that I highly suggest for those of you in schools, charters, you have a little bit more leeway with your pre-service and things of that nature. Could you go back to the previous slide? Charter school, I think we're going forward. So charter schools have a little bit more leeway when it comes to like their pre-service in the summer and things of that nature. So it's not always built in, but that's a conversation for another day. NYC DOE schools, it's usually 2 days before. So one of the things that we want to kind of consider is what are some things coming down the pipeline? Y'all, we can schedule emails. Now, it may not be that your school staff has access to like all parent emails, but as you're capturing them, it can be something you do. You could send out like a monthly newsletter, some things to think about, a conversation to have with your child, just a general prompt. Or it can just be, the SEL theme of the month, or as it pertains specifically to ADHD tips and tricks and things of that nature. So that can just be something general. Now, some parents may respond, that might not be what you want, but it could also be a good way to increase engagement because it's something that they can learn to expect. In your initial one, you could say how often you're going to send it out. whether it's monthly, quarterly. The goal too is to make it realistic, because you know that you have a lot of things going on. For those of you that who may be working in private practices or other community-based agencies, you may want to try to send out something quarterly, or like offer like a little something that has a tip, a trick, a suggestion that they could utilize to implement in their relationship, or to increase maybe a skill that they both could benefit from, regardless to whether one person is neurodivergent or not. Notes and checklists. Oh, did you? And then setting them up with something. And this is something that could also be recurring, because you can reuse these. Once they're created, the possibilities are endless. The Remind app, I love it. Free, y'all. Now, not for everyone, because it past a certain point you have to pay for it. But if you get people to subscribe, it's basically like sending out something mass. It can go either to their email or to their phones. One of the features that I love about it, and which is why I started using it, is because it could automatically translate things to Spanish. I am not a Spanish speaker, unfortunately. I've taken lessons. My verb conjugation is trash, but I have no problem taking language that someone sends me, whether it's email or text message, throw it into Google Translate and putting it back. I know it is not ideal, but one of the things that I have found is that it has been received positively, that, oh, this person that doesn't speak the language is trying to communicate with me. So we want to kind of build on that momentum. So the Remind app is good. You can attach things from your Google Drive. You can put PDFs. It can be really convenient because you can have the app on your phone and also use it web-based. Having a counseling website or a resource website, something that parents can anchor to. Many organizations, they utilize Google. Google Sites is free, so you can use it in any organization. Now, I don't know what Microsoft 365 and all that have, but if you even want to start like a free Google account, so you can create something like that and you can update it as needed. You can possibly anchor some of those other things, like you would send out an email, or having those checklists on the site as like a download, as an Excel sheet that they can access. And then I put homework hotline on here because Dial Teacher is still a thing, y'all. I used it back in the day and it's still available, but there are other expansions of these services as well. And it can be a really good way to not just offer a resource that is helpful, not just for maybe the ADHD student, but also for any other students in the home. And then also sometimes the parent can also get on the line and communicate about some of what's going on with the academic pieces that will allow them. Math is one of the big ones, because like I mentioned, the way they teach math now is not the way they taught it before. So it can really increase communication and engagement with parents, or at the very least, show them that you're paying attention. Because one of the chief complaints that I hear from parents is they feel like the school doesn't know their kid, or the school isn't paying attention to their specific needs. So even if it's not the specific need, you're throwing out information, intervention, and resources that can be helpful if they, are looking for something to try. Next slide, please. Resource management. Manage y'all's resources. You find things, you stumble on websites. If you're not necessarily sure how to organize it right away, download it. Throw that bad boy in a Google Drive folder. You can synthesize it later, but you will most likely remember that you found a thing. Where did I put it? In a Google Drive. Email blast, like I mentioned in the last one. You find a great resource. You're on a listserv. Shout out to Fabu Listserv if y'all not on it, get on it, because you work with children and youth. If you find it, send it out to your colleagues, send it to parents. Say, hey, here's a great resource for this that you may want to try. Just putting it out there. Similarly, monthly newsletter. If there's something that's happening every month, or if you curated a calendar of themes that you want to tackle, it can be really easy for you to cull resources so that when it comes time to put your newsletter out, you out here just chilling. Loom is a great resource. You can do even the free account. I think you can do up to like 5-minute videos, and you can record yourself doing some of these things, because like people like content, they like videos, and you can have it in a library and also repurpose it for your usage. And this is not just folks that are working in schools. If you're working in community-based organizations, sports, spiritual, these are things that really connect to people, and then they can get to kind of know you and your style a little bit, especially if they were on the fence about like how they could talk to you or what they could talk to you about. And you could also use that for mini workshops, or even Zoom. Record yourself on Zoom. Give yourself 10 minutes. Everybody got 10 minutes, whether they're washing dishes, they could put it on to listen to a car. People do podcasts, things of that nature. And tap into your resources, your colleagues, having somebody come in to be a guest speaker, or maybe even recording something that you could utilize at another time can be really helpful. It's also a great way for parents to network and learn about what other resources are available in their community or virtually. Next slide, please. So things that I have integrated with counseling. So like this is a little old, I'm not gonna lie, because they are getting rid of Jamboard on Google. But Jamboard, for those of you who do not know, is basically a whiteboard. So we have the whiteboard feature on Zoom, and I know that there are a lot of apps and sites where you can do that. If you are doing virtual counseling or virtual work with youth, it can be really helpful, especially because it's collaborative and it anchors to that visual piece that really resonate with folks with ADHD. Rocketbook is dope, y'all. Absolutely dope. And it's basically made of like this material where you can use like a cloth, and you use a special pen called Frixion. I think I'm saying it right. And you can just wipe the page away when you're done. But the best part of it is that you can upload it to your phone or to another app so that it also digitizes what you utilize. If you don't want to necessarily invest in the book, if you go on the Rocketboard website, you can also try out the pages. You can just print the pages and utilize the app for free to try it out to see if you would like it, or maybe you're just not in that special place where you're ready to make that investment. So that's helpful. Thank you, Kim, who stated Padlet has a Jamboard or alternative. Padlet is also really cute and I love it. I did not add it here, but that is a good one. And you can transfer your Jamboards to Padlet until maybe 12.1 or so. So if there are some of you who are using Jamboard, this can be a good resource for you. So thank you, Kim, for that. So Rocketboard beacons. Oh wait, I don't have my other dry erase board down here. So there's these little triangular looking things that you stick on the edges of your dry erase board, and it when you use the Rocketboard app, if you're doing a group activity, I love to use the whiteboard with group activities, have everybody involved in adding something to it in some kind of way. For those of you who may work in schools or may work in places where you save artifacts or utilize them for some things, this can be a wonderful resource for you to utilize and also map out. I've done timeline activities. We've done drawing activities, all kinds of things that you may want to utilize. Maybe some of y'all are up for tenure. Maybe you're trying to, put in a program in place and you want to utilize something as a pilot. This can be a wonderful thing for that. Kahoot. Man, it's basically like playing a game on your phone. If you are in schools and places that allow phones, this can be handy, or you have tablets to access. It's a good way to gamify information. I use it a lot when I'm providing psychoed because they don't want to come to counseling and learn about more stuff, but it's stuff that will help them. So if we gamify it, we're kind of tricking them a little bit, which sometimes is what counseling is with certain youth. Mentimeter. I absolutely love. You can do interactive activities where you go to a website, type in a number. You can add, you can do like a word cloud. You can do a scaling question. As the responses come in, you get to watch it on the screen. So it's like super interactive. And then it gives you a visual that you can utilize and explore in other different ways and expand on. And then we have video and computer games. These are things that they feel really comfortable with. So the same way I mentioned the gamified aspect of it, you kind of want to think about, okay, if they're using Roblox and you're so sick of Roblox, what is the value in Roblox? How can you turnkey that into something that you're working on, whether it's academic or social emotional? How can you utilize the themes, the colors, the characters? And sometimes it seems like they're just playing a game. They're like, oh, this is cool, but they're actually kind of learning and processing through something. And then apps, there's a bunch of different apps that are available. You can even do do a prompt into chat GPT, identifying like what is the thing that you want to work on or explore, and is there an app that maybe this youth or this adolescent can utilize on their own time? Maybe there is an app that you can utilize in your sessions or in the time that you meet with them, so that's something that they can continue on their own because you're trying to model how you can utilize technology for A, B, or C. So it can be a good continuation and a good reflection. Next slide, please. And now we're Q&A time because I gave y'all at least a few things to think about in terms of effective supports for ADHD, but I'm down to answer any questions that you have to the best of my ability. And I'm not afraid to say I don't know something. I've been doing this for a minute, so I know a few things, but I will be completely honest. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, so I see one of the questions we have is what strategies do you recommend with a kid in college? You want to support independence and scaffold when necessary. What do you recommend? So not to ask clarifying questions in place, so I will make the assumption that regardless to whether this is a student that has an ADHD diagnosis or you may be seeing signs or symptoms or things that kind of let you know, I will say for if they're not let me say not diagnosed, kind of like identifying from them, what's coming up for them to see if you can possibly quantify, like, is it the environment, the scheduling, the structure, because it does differentiate from high school. And part of the struggle too, and many of us are probably remember hearing this, all your teachers are not going to look after you in college. They're not going to run after you for work, this, that, and the other. But some of us know, because I know there are a few college professors in here, we know that we do be running after them. So like identifying like what is their expectation, like what would they like to have if we're hitting them with the miracle question. If everything was exactly the way you wanted it to be in college, what would it look like? If everything was exactly the way that you wanted it to be to get an A in this class, what do you think you would need to do? So that can be one thing, because you're obtaining the knowledge and what they're envisioning, and that could be in direct contrast to what you're envisioning, but it can help you with identifying strategies. But if I had to think of things that were specific, I would think of calendar utilization. So is this somebody that's regularly on their phone? Are they using, if they have a iPhone, are they using like the iCalendar? I'm an Android, y'all. So if I'm using the wrong terminology, please don't come for me. I'm trying. Are they using the calendar? I'm a Google Calendar person. Is that something they're utilizing? Do they have like a desk calendar, something to anchor? Would it be helpful to kind of put it on the wall and actually like write on it? And then in terms of like the scheduling, putting the schedule actually on the calendar, whether it's the class schedule, and if this is like a commuter student, somebody that's not living on campus, what time do I have to leave my house to get to class on time? In creating a buffer, like if lateness is a thing that they have been working on or may be inconsistent with, building in those buffers. If this is a student that benefits from actual study time, what does studying look like? Is body doubling or accountability helpful? Like, are you taking a class with somebody you know? Is there somebody you feel comfortable with? Is there like a tutoring center? So kind of ascertaining what kind of makes sense for them. Now, these could be things that worked well for them in high school that they could translate over, but it can also feel overwhelming to understand what the college, the school has available. So I think that perhaps if at all possible, one of the things that you could look into is kind of like reviewing whether it's on the website or if you're going in person to identify like what are the things that are available. Like, is there a student health center? Is there a tutoring center, a writing center? Is it staff with peers? Like we were talking about that peer tutoring. That may be a hook to kind of get them to go in. Is there, a girl or a boy or a person that identifies as non-binary that is like, their vibe that may kind of like draw them in. So the hard part, and I'm not a parent, though I have been working with youth for a long time, is creating that nice balance of supportive independence, because we do want to give them the opportunity to kind of try things out on their own. So it can be really helpful to just be like, is it okay if like I ask how that's going? I mean, they can be like, no, but they'd be like, okay, I'm sorry that that's not okay, but like, I just really want to help, or I just want to know, because I'm just going to wonder. And if I ask you that one time and you tell me, I don't have to keep asking you. So that's usually kind of how like I low-key bully a little bit. Just like, I just want to circle back to this to see how it went, because maybe we may need to revise it. Maybe this isn't the best fit. So it can be really helpful to do that. And then another thing that could also be helpful, especially if we're doing this ahead of time, is identifying if there's anything specific that can be helpful. So students that have IEPs when they're in high school, they don't have IEPs in college, but because you had one or because you may know what you need, there are offices depending on what school you go to. So in some places, the Office of Access, there goes Kim, right on time. So Office of Accessibility, she put register with Disability Services Office, which, you know, that can be also another title of the office, because they do support students that have a variety of different learning needs, that may have mental health needs, that may have physical disabilities, and give it to make sure that everything that the college or the program has that's available to help create and build more equity into their learning experience, they have access to. And then meeting with the instructors ahead of time. Like, I had students that sent me emails 2 weeks beforehand, just saying, hey, like, I just wanted to let you know about like what's going on with me. Do you have time to meet? It's great that they're able to advocate for themselves in that way, but asking like what they need, because that also is building into the independence. Because as a parent, you're doing all that you can and you're planting the seeds, but they need to begin to practice. So even identifying like, what would that feel like if, you know, you were just, asked to meet your instructor ahead of time so they get to know you, to kind of gauge what that's looking like. So there are also places where, and not sometimes in schools, but there are also community-based organizations where they'll have an advocate that can support students with having those conversations, or at least culling a bulk of the information that's accessible and allowing them to work collaboratively to kind of like plan out which ones they want to do. So I think that one of the things that can feel overwhelming is, okay, I am independent, but I don't know where to start because there's so many options. So sometimes having that advocate that isn't directly related, a parent or a family member, but this is something that they do in their wheelhouse. And sometimes they have these individuals available on college campuses. Sometimes it's an upperclassman that had been through it before. So it's kind of like a mentorship opportunity for them as well. So it could be a question to do that. And as far as scaffolding, kind of identifying or just asking like the general question of like, oh, there's steps to this. Like sometimes like I'll play it dumb, like I don't know, like how do you, oh, like that's a lot, like maybe that we could break that down. So like it's not just like, oh, you automatically need this, but it's just like, how's that feeling? Like, do we want to break, like, oh man, like I wish I could just, cut this in half. And so just kind of making it a little bit more, like, I know it sounds and probably feels a little bit silly to say, but we do want to give them the space and the autonomy to be able to try and practice, because again, we're working on the persistence. So if they're not willing to try and practice, we want to get them there. If they tried this one time early in the semester and now we at midterms and they say we're trying again, to me that's a win, because they could have just given up and lost motivation, which none of us want here. So we have to try our very, very best to also tap into our own supportive circles as parents when we have kids transitioning into college, to kind of take the temperature on where we are and like how we're kind of creating that space. I don't know if that's helpful. I hope it is. These are strategies that I have used with college students before. Some parents have said that they've been really helpful. Others, it took a little bit more massaging, to say the least. And you are very welcome. Okay, do you have recommendations for young folks with ADHD and struggle with friendships, specifically reciprocity? I have students who love, I'll talk all about themselves, but struggle with keeping friends because of lack of reciprocity. Whew. So this is a general struggle, and I completely understand where you're coming from with this. So I would say anywhere between, I'd say middle school is the hardest with this, because they're finally getting to a place where they identify that, they are individuals, but they don't know what that means. But these are things that can also manifest in, I'd say, upper elementary, because they're still kind of like developmentally kind of, wandering around a little bit before that. But I think a lot of modeling would be helpful here. Sometimes, especially if you're in a setting where, you are facilitating a group or another type of activity, or that can possibly be created, it's possible that one of the things that could be really helpful is turning it into a modeling exercise, or the same way I was mentioning a little bit before, where like somebody has a job or like something that is rotated. Like it could be something where it's just like it needs to be smaller and more repetitious, because it's just like, especially with the talking a lot or the interrupting, that can feel really jarring for kids, because it's like they all kind of like want to talk over each other, they all like want to be in the moment, so it can feel really hard. So it's just like, okay, like wait, like, let's pause and like try this again, or let's like, I'm trying to think of, I'll utilize TikTok as an example. No, not TikTok. Oh my God, brain fart. Not that old. Not Instagram, Snap. No, you don't. Ah, Group chats. Group chats are things that have come up, and for those of you that work in schools, you know that they're causing all kinds of problems. But a lot of times, because there isn't that in-person connection, they take it to the group chat. So one of the ways that we can kind of like pull back against that, especially if hopefully they're in a friend group when they're in the school or they're in another community-based space, like how are we acting the same way in the group chat as we do in real time? Why or why not? And that can be a good opportunity to kind of like identify, because sometimes the part of the reason that they're struggling with friendships is because they're at an age where they're not really sure what a good friend is. They're struggling with girl code, guy code, boundaries, consent, things of that nature. And that kind of makes the friendships murky. And then because of the manifestation of whichever type of ADHD it is, the energy and the reciprocity, they kind of just like teeter. So it could be a situation where maybe in a one-on-one conversation, kind of like identify, like, what are you seeing? Like that feel like how on a scale of, and I love scaling, on a scale of 1 to 5, and I hit them with this, with 1 being absolute trash, throw it away, start over, and 5 being I'm living my absolute best life, can't tell me nothing. Where do you think this situation, or where do you think how you acted, how you spoke, how you interrupted fell on this scale for this person? So like building in a little bit more of that empathy sometimes, because they do struggle historically with the empathy, and putting them in the shoes of the other person can at times help with the reciprocity piece of it. And I think that one of the additional struggles too is, and I haven't seen this as much in middle school, but it happens a lot in high school, is that, ADHD is trendy right now. They are all on TikTok. So everybody thinks they have ADHD. So it's like there's the people that have it in terms of they've received a formal diagnosis, they may be receiving treatment, they may be receiving they may be taking medication for medication management, and then it's just like, oh, this person, here they go saying, oh, you have ADHD, or oh, you're bipolar, and things of that nature. So there could be some desire to reciprocate the fact that I also have this thing that I may not have, or I may be showing signs and symptoms of. So it can also be really helpful for the person that has the formal diagnosis. Oh, like, well, what do you know about it? So they can be in a realm where they're like kind of teaching into, and kind of like, making their diagnosis a little bit more cool for those that like they know they don't got it, but like they want to be down. And that can be another way to kind of like build it in. I hope that helps. Anybody else? Y'all better come on. Like, I know y'all like sick of hearing me talk. Yeah, come on now. Yeah, I'll start singing. Y'all better come on.
Hey, everybody. Well, if there is no more questions, we can leave maybe 1 more minute for questions. And then I'm going to put some links in the chat here for December today and some just follow-up surveys that we would really love for you guys to complete. And
Oh,
yeah,
we have another question.
yeah,
How have
perfect.
oh man, how have you managed having ADHD and having so many roles? Well, when you say managed, but no, realistically, I will say trial and error has been one of them. Utilization of therapy. So I do have a therapist that I've had for some time, and if and when she decides to retire, I'm going to be devastated. I also have a coach. So I benefit from structure and rest. That was something that it took me a long time to be able to do. And recognizing the signs and symptoms in my body that come up for me when I'm not getting what I need. So if I feel like, as someone who knows that they talk excessively, if that has increased, what is happening that it has increased? If I am fidgeting more often than not, if I go from sitting to standing to moving, and like what is happening in my environment or in my personal space that is also impacting that. And that is one of, especially over the last few years, because I was in a car accident a few years ago. So like the way that I'm able to work has changed. So I think that one of the ways that has been extremely helpful for me is to tap into like the way my body is responding to my environment and expectations. And similar to what I had mentioned before, utilizing a calendar. So I have my personal calendar that had me have like doctor's appointments and, personal things. Then I have my coaching calendar because that was my first business. Now I own a therapy practice. So all those calendars are linked up together. So in addition to making sure that I don't double or overbook with clients or other engagements, everything is laid out for me. It's also color coded, Google y'all, so I can get an accurate representation. So even the screen that I'm using right now to do this presentation, it's about 27 inches. And the reason that's helpful for me is because I have my calendar pinned to the desktop, so it's always visible. So I know what's coming up. I know if I need to cancel something. I know if like maybe I played myself and I scheduled too many things in a day and I'm not going to have the full capacity. It has been extremely helpful for me to pre-plan, because one of the ways that my ADHD also manifests is that I have anxiety. Very, very bad anxiety, but I have spent a lot of time managing it. So being prepared is one of the best ways we can also manage anxiety. And I call my anxiety Annie. Those of you who know me in real life know I'll be telling you that like, yo, Annie, yeah, she be on it. Like she was playing with me before I came out here with y'all. I'm like, yo, ADHD is my bag. I can do this. So kind of like pushing through some of the awkwardness and the discomfort, and recognizing too, like, what is this serving? Like literally asking the question out loud, is this serving me? How? Sometimes we do need to do that level of self-reflection, because I've had to take a lot of things off of my plate, but I really enjoy what I do. So even if I have to take it off the plate, that doesn't mean it can't come back at some time. And then being honest with myself about what that looks like. And I think that's one of the things that has been extremely helpful for me. So thank you. How do you as a therapist help a parent who is undiagnosed ADHD with their ADHD child? Whew, okay, so the couple of things. If the parent feels like they're undiagnosed, is that something they want to do something about? Because some of us, we want to know and we want to have like a label, a title for what's going on with us, because it helps us basically kind of like quantify like some of our experiences and things of that nature. Some people don't want that. Some people are just like, okay, maybe I have it, maybe I don't. And I think one of the things that transitions and can be really helpful in between those two things is that regardless of whether you have a diagnosis or you don't have a diagnosis, the strategies can be helpful for you. There are people that have other diagnoses that utilize some of the tips, tricks, and tools that ADHD folks use, and they identify that it's helpful for them. So one of the ways that you can work with, and it could be your family therapist, or it could be because a lot of times therapists that work with children, they will include the parent into either a portion of the session, or they may switch off. So depending on in which way is working, kind of like identifying like from the perspective of like strategies, like what could be feasible, maybe what's something that we can kind of tackle together. And another situation that is really helpful to explore, especially for a parent that feels like they may have undiagnosed ADHD, some of the same questions and assessment that you are doing verbally in terms of, you know, what's coming up for you during class or tests or getting started with the essay, kind of exploring with the parent what came up for them when they were in school, or even if they are in a more traditional workplace or have had a more traditional work and professional work environment, like what things have manifested in those places, because it can be really helpful too to also see like what is similar with the child. Like the parent may know this from like visually seeing their child in whatever, you know, age or grade or whatever they're in, but they may not be connecting it to their own experience. And we know because, you know, we pass things down to our children, you know, hopefully things that are positive, sometimes things that are not so positive, and we may not be reviewing it in the same way. So as we're working on interventions and strategies to address and hopefully manage and increase functioning, that can be something that not only are we working on collaboratively from the perspective of creating an increase or a decrease of whatever it is that we're working on, but you're not alone. You have that kind of built-in accountability, and hopefully not too much pressure on the point of the child, because they're just like, oh, like I can't do anything, or like this is really hard, to kind of, you know, built in that collaborative spirit, like we're doing this together. Like I'm doing it for like work, or I'm doing it for like to do this better or more efficiently in the house. So making it kind of like a bonding experience almost can be really helpful. I have done this with a few people in the past, and I will say that it does feel hard because a lot of times the parent, especially mothers, they kind of internalize like, why didn't I pick up on this? You know, why didn't I, you know, address it? Because then if I did address it, then, you know, I would be better equipped to support my child. That's not necessarily true. But what really helps children of variety of different ages is knowing that they're not alone. So I think that that can be one of the most grounding pieces of like doing this work with your child, because it's just like, you know what? I don't have all the answers. I'm learning too. Hope that's helpful. Not a question, just a point. For students in general education, the teachers have difficulty understanding the impact of the diagnosis. My son has ADHD as an in gen ed. I work in D75 with ED students. Some have ADHD, and I can see the difference in tolerance and understanding. I can definitely agree with that, because I've had very similar experiences. And I think that even though we educationally know kind of what the diagnosis of ADHD is, we're not always super well versed in how it may manifest and show up in youth individually, and how things may exacerbate or put up what's the word I'm looking for? So when kids are in groups or in places and spaces, what definitely comes up in other spaces that may not organically come up individually, or maybe with a small group of 2 or 3. Because seeing my kids in a group of 4 or 5 in my office and seeing them in a group of 25 in the classroom and in recess were very different. And I think that as we don't identify maybe trends or themes that come up, it can feel really challenging for general ed teachers, and even sometimes special education teachers, depending on where they have spent the breadth of their experience, because just because a student may have like a learning disability or a speech and language delay, they may manifest differently to a student that has ADHD. They may manifest differently, whether it's type 1 or type 2. So inattentive or hyperactive. So it can feel really jarring, especially as a parent and working in an educational setting, because it's just like, all right already. But I do think that that is a point that we do need to talk about a little bit more, because it is a diagnosis that is fairly prevalent. And like some of the others mentioned, there are folks who are undiagnosed. Like I've been doing this a long time and it took me a long time to get right with my diagnosis. So like I can see it, but that doesn't necessarily, I'm like, oh, maybe you should get diagnosed. But it's just like, oh, just like you mentioned in your statement, the impact. Like, what is the impact? So I want to thank you for sharing that because maybe some of the other members here may not have heard or had that experience. And how do you decipher the difference between ADHD and non-verbal learning disability? What are your strategies for clients with dual diagnosis? So when I do assessments, I usually am not specifically looking for learning disabilities only because traditionally a neuropsychologist would have to be able to diagnose that. Not to say that the assessments that are available that myself as a clinical social worker can be trained on can't do it, but in certain places and spaces in the Department of Education, they will only take certain assessments that were completed by neuropsychologists. Even sometimes neuropsychology students that are in grad programs, they're supervised. Bio-neuropsychologists they won't take because it hasn't been signed. So it's like a whole thing. But in situations where I do feel, based on my professional expertise, that it could be a nonverbal learning disability, I will refer out because sometimes it can be both. And sometimes it can be either or. So that's a situation, especially when individuals are paying out of pocket for these assessments and evaluations, we want to make sure that we get it right the first time. So I can't say specifically that I would be able to decipher the difference because I could have an inkling, but because most of the individuals that will come to me for evaluation, especially with as it pertains to ADHD, is usually academic support, not more so I want to use this to get an IEP for myself or my child. If it's a situation where it is a student of an age where they just want to figure out if there is an ADHD diagnosis and they're not sure if there's a learning disability, then I will definitely refer out because I want to make sure that they have everything they need in a one-stop shop. And I don't do both of those things. So I just wanted to be clear about that. And then strategies for clients with dual diagnosis. It depends on the diagnosis, honestly, because I have a client right now that has ADHD and autism. I have another one who is struggling with some very significant PTSD and ADHD, but her ADHD also manifests in anxiety, significant anxiety and depression as a result of some of the things that happened with her PTSD. So it really depends on what the two or multiple diagnoses can look like. But I come from a framework of working on a lot of strategies. DBT is my favorite because DBT and youth, if y'all not using DBT with youth, explore it because it is the bee's knees. So I think for this question, like I would probably need to know which diagnoses to answer a little bit better. But I'd say most of what I presented in the presentation can anchor to any diagnoses, but we may need to scaffold based on what some of the environmental factors are. I also think about rationale for support because some people have a large support system. Other people may just have a mom or a dad, sometimes a foster parent. So I kind of also ascertaining what the supports are that are available. And are there any other community-based supports that could also possibly be accessible to kind of like bolster and increase what's already available? So I apologize if I wasn't able to answer this more clearly because I would just need a little bit more information, but I do hope that at least I got you on the right track. Elizabeth, you are very welcome. And I see, and I'm sure all of you have had the opportunity to kind of go through what was put in the chat. But yeah, like y'all might want to tap on that evaluation if you haven't. And if any of you want to do CEs, like this is fun, y'all. Y'all better go ahead. But thank you for your time and your attention. And if you have like any other like questions that are lingering or something that may pop into your mind, like after you get off of this call, you could always shoot me an email, Paula@personalizeyourcoaching.life. Also personalize your coaching on Instagram if you want to reach out, or have any questions or scenarios that you want to run through. And that's pretty much it for me. You, thank you, Dr. Cindy. I appreciate it. And thank you everyone for taking time out of your Friday Eve to talk about ADHD strategies. I could talk about this forever, as you can tell. You are very welcome, Kim. You are very welcome, Clarissa. Thank you for attending. I hope all of y'all have a fabulous evening.